Hello, everyone. This is the 203rd episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview English author Mr. Gary Sherrard discussing his book, The Wilderness Years, Newcastle United 1978 to 1984. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Welcome to you too.
Thank you. So, can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yes, born in Newcastle, in the heart of the northeast of England, a good few years ago now. Born into a mad keen football region in a mad keen football family. No real choice about which team to support. Everybody around us, Newcastle was everything, and grew up that way. I was fortunate enough to see my team get to an FA Cup final when I was 7 years old. Unfortunately, got hammered by Liverpool on that occasion. I remember crying after the game, and that was an introduction that told you everything about being a Newcastle United supporter in that era.
And it would only get worse for a while at least. So, what sparked your interest in writing about this phase of Newcastle United?
The story is really a story of myself and a group of friends and a generation of fans who were brought up between the 1950s, the three FA Cup final wins in 5 years at the start of the 50s that my dad and his generation would have seen as schoolboys, caught up between that and the 1990s entertainers. And there's this dark period in the middle. I didn't do it to chronicle the dark period in itself. It's a chronicle of growing up as a football supporter. Just happens to be one of the worst periods of time in your team's fortunes. But it didn't matter to us. We were on the way in when thousands were on their way out. And there was just a lot of memories from that period. And I sort of bracketed it around this wilderness of 6 years in the second division. But really, it didn't matter that we were in the second division to us. We just wanted to be there on match day and grow up as match day regulars, whatever the team was doing. It was our team. And for all those guys who were there, it's remained our team.
And most of your book appears to be first-hand recollections of you as a young fan at that time. But as far as the actual research process, how was that like and the duration to write this book?
Yeah, I've always been an inveterate note taker, diary keeper, scrapbook collector, cut things out of newspapers and magazines, had posters on my walls that once they came down off the wall got folded up and put into scrapbooks or into piles in folders, in desk drawers, all those kind of things. So I had that kind of resource. I have a large amount of football books stacked around me. I'm in about the only space in this room that hasn't got books on it at the moment. And then it was every little thing I saw around those games, match programs. If I saw a front page picture from a match program, it triggered another memory, it triggered a story. I'd see a player's name and I would remember something about those players. And all those stories, I just felt it was time to knit them together before I'd forgotten them all, before that generation have been forgotten completely. And I did a certain amount of research around, I want to be factually correct in the book, obviously, but what I do say in the intro is it's my truth the way I remember it. I was a 12 to 17, 18-year-old in that period. Some of the things that really meant a lot to me then might not have meant much to somebody who was 35 with children. But the things about the excitement of a match day, growing up, being allowed to go with your friends, those kind of things, that's first-hand recollection with a bit of research around it. Name checked a lot of players because that's what you do as a young fan. The players mean everything. Probably the individual players mean more than the team in a certain respect because we used to pick teams in the playground and you wanted to be your hero. And if you were playing up front, you wanted to be the striker from Newcastle. If you're playing on the wing, you wanted to be the wing from Newcastle. So all those things rolled together into this one story framed around, unfortunately, a pretty dark period in the club's history. I try not to focus too much on the darkness. I want to try to portray the excitement of match day in a young crowd. Obviously, the background to that is it's pretty bleak for the football team in that period, and it's a pretty bleak time period for a lot of the region, the town, the football team is based in as well. It's the end of the big industrial age for the Northeast. Coal mining and shipbuilding is on its last legs. So there's a bit of social reflection in there as well.
So let's go back in time. What was the status of Newcastle United in the English football landscape as we come to the mid 1970s?
I think you'd probably call Newcastle fallen giants at that stage. Like I said, the 1950s period was a glorious period in three FA Cup final wins in 5 years. The start of that period in the early 50s is probably the most consistent Newcastle had been towards the top of the table. I think they were fourth, fifth, fourth in a sequence. Since the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, it was a very successful club with FA Cup appearances, if not that many wins, and a few league titles in there as well. And then into the 50s, after coming out of the second division at the end of the Second World War, and then into the 50s successful period. But up to the 70s, I think you would always say it's an inconsistent team. Inconsistency has run through the club quite a lot through its history. Had cup runs in 69, won a European trophy at the first time of asking, but only got there through the very strange rules that applied at the time and qualified into European competition, finishing mid-table. Then in 74, got to an FA Cup final when I was at the very impressionable age with walls covered in posters. And if I see the 1974 semi-final on social media or TV now, still get those goosebumps. It just meant such a lot. Lost in 74 to Liverpool. Ironically, Kevin Keegan scored twice for Liverpool that day. Then 76 got through to the League Cup final. That wasn't shown on live TV in those days, so you had to wait 24 hours to even see the highlights. But we knew Newcastle had lost 2-1 in that one. And then only Newcastle could get into Europe, play in Europe, and get relegated within one calendar year. So that was the 77, 78 era. You think this club has turned the corner into Europe. This is amazing. It was a great experience to listen to the radio, listen to the local radio on those nights in Europe. And the end of that season, finish with 22 points and be relegated a long way short of safety with a pretty abject performance in the second half of the season. So you painting the picture, inconsistency is a big part of it, and lost opportunities will be a big part of that. But the glory days seem to be a long way in the distance already by the sort of late 70s.
You grew up in a world where replica kits were still not a thing, and it was mainly about scarves. So, where were you in life at this point and the level of your fandom? And can you paint a picture of the world, of the life of a young football fan at this point?
Yeah, I think the big thing to try to convey, I mean, it may mean quite a difficult understanding for people now, but mid 70s, our TV sport was match of the day on a Saturday night, highlights of two games from the top division normally. And then we had a regional program spread around the country on a Sunday lunchtime with highlights of one of your region's games. Live TV was the FA Cup final and England versus Scotland in the home internationals, both in May. The rest of the season, you had no live football at all. Highlights European games on a Wednesday night if you were old enough to stay up till 10:30 for sports night. So the fix that you got from your football was really about going to a match on a Saturday. And I do remember if you missed a game, you felt like you had little to contribute for the full week because we had to have that memory of 3 o'clock on a Saturday. That was going to serve you right through the week until the next game. Not like today with 24-hour rolling news to comment on. We had a regional morning newspaper and a regional evening newspaper, which had plenty of Newcastle United coverage, but just that part of not being able to react to stories that were happening at the time, you might have to wait until the next day before you saw even a mention in the newspaper. So whatever you did on a Saturday had a massive bearing on the full week and which conversation groups you were in, which friends you were going to knock around with, the kind of things you were going to try to recreate with a football in the school playground or in the field. We would probably play football every single night after school. We'd play football in the playground at school every single day. The period in the book, I am 11 at the start of that. I had been to probably a half dozen games at St James's Park by that stage. taken by parents or family friends to get used to it, and it wasn't a pretty place in those days. But that didn't matter to a 9, 10, 11 year old. Being part of the match was all that mattered. So that was me. It was very much a eat, sleep, and drink football, as my grandparents used to say. Everything revolved around playing football, watching football, talking about football with friends. We had replica kit, but you had sort of one shirt, and the team would wear that shirt for 3 or 4 seasons before the next one came. And it was there wasn't the mass of replica gear you can get now with training kits and things like that. So yeah, when what you had, you cherished and you kept a hold of, and it just mattered a huge amount.
Yeah, and as far as not only the newspapers, I imagine the only reading material would have been Shoot magazine, perhaps, where you could see color photographs sometimes.
I'll say shoot, and I'll also defend Match, which came
Oh,
out slightly later because I used to
right.
work there. So I have to give Match
Of
Weekly a
course.
mention because that was yeah. But the shoot posters would go on the wall. We didn't have World Soccer because that was a lot more words than pictures. So as kids, you wanted, if you found out that there was a picture of a Newcastle player in colour in shoot that week, you were double determined to go and get one. Then there was that big quandary that you had of, if I tear this page out, I haven't got a complete copy of the magazine anymore, praying that somebody else might sacrifice a page if you wanted to put on your wall. The 74 Cup run, there were some souvenir editions of local newspapers brought out, glossy paper posters on the wall. So they probably survived on the wall for a good 2 seasons until the next one. And those little giveaways, remember the fixture card that came in the evening paper at the start of the season? That was like absolute gold dust. And it was a tiny little card with an advert for beer on the back of it, because everything had advertising for beer in those days. And just the list of fixtures. And when you looked through it and try to pick out your games, whether you were going to go or not, you picked out the big ones in there. And because it was such a shortage of information, that kind of information, probably after a few weeks of the season, there'd be somebody in our group could reel off the next 10 weeks fixtures because that was the information you had. So that's what you gobbled up and that's what you kept. Everybody knew what date the cup final was going to be in May, though the chances of your team being there were going to be extremely slim. But it was very much a structured calendar around the league and the FA Cup.
You grew up idolizing Malcolm McDonald, Super Mac, and point to his sale to Arsenal as the reference point of the team's decline. Can you describe his importance and naturally the significance of his loss?
Yeah, I think for the uninitiated or people from outside the region, Malcolm MacDonald is probably the most popular Londoner to ever surfaced in the northeast of England. We're 300 miles away, and general suspicion of people from the capital city or even from anywhere south of Newcastle. But Malcolm MacDonald arrived. He arrived in a Rolls Royce smoking a cigar. He had charisma. He had a big mouth, but he backed it up on the pitch. Very exciting player, powerful, very left-footed, but powerful, very, very quick, sort of sprinter's physique, powerful guy. And he scored a lot of pretty spectacular goals. And when you're a young lad, I say in the book there's a line, Malcolm MacDonald was my first football hero, but that doesn't make me special because in the Northeast, anybody around my age would say that. Before you pick up the fine parts of a football team and perhaps want to emulate somebody who plays in your position, everybody worshipped Super Mac. Just had everything, entertainment and excitement went part and parcel of his game. And I think the rest of the team very much knew they were there to supply the ammunition for Malcolm MacDonald. So to take that influence out of the team, I think when you're a young lad, you expect your heroes to stay at your team forever. You're not really thinking about your players going elsewhere. And Malcolm MacDonald suddenly becomes an Arsenal player. That is pretty hard to swallow. Those wounds never heal. If I speak to people of my age, the name of Gordon Lee will come up very quickly with the name of Malcolm MacDonald. He's the manager that sold Super Mac to Arsenal. And MacDonald had the following season was top scorer, I think, in the Football League with Arsenal, including 3 against Newcastle the first time he played against us. So those kind of things, they're still open wounds. But it was without even trying to backtrack on it and looking back on its influence from here, looking at its influence even at the time, there was something changed there. The players who replaced him weren't the star material, very good players in some instances who did a great job for the team, but they didn't have the excitement or the charisma of Malcolm MacDonald. He scored a hat-trick against Liverpool in his home debut and had his teeth knocked out and was carried off after a collision with the goalkeeper. Those kind of things, that is what working class heroes are like. They're the guys that you want to see every week. So when they come out of the team, I think the natural inclination straight away is to find, well, who's the next Malcolm MacDonald? And with the best will in the world, there aren't many of those kind of players around.
In your book, you go in depth about your match day routines and rituals and going to St. James's Park unaccompanied. I imagine that must have been the norm back then, right? For young lads go to football matches with the rest of their friends.
Yeah, trying to explain it to my own son when he was of a similar age, and I look and I think there is absolutely no way I was going to allow him to go to the football on his own at
Right. I mean,
12
it was a
years old.
different world back then, I imagine, in that
It
sense.
was
Yeah.
different. Absolutely, it was different. We generally traveled in numbers. There was usually five or six of us going to a game, and as we got older, perhaps the numbers got smaller, and then you'd meet other people at the ground rather than meeting at home. But when you were a group of five or six, the world centered around you and not what was going around the outside of it. Football wasn't in a great place in the UK in this period in the late 70s, early 80s. Hooliganism and racism are really part and parcel of a match day. But I always felt, I never ever felt scared, and I never thought that my parents were worried about me going to the football. They probably thought I was quick enough to get out of the way, cheeky enough to get out of the way, but they also just thought those kind of things happen to people who get in a fight at the football at that stage are probably people who are going to get into a fight. Probably a later generation was when there was more innocent bystanders there, but there'd be a flare up in the corner of the terrace at one end. 5 minutes, everybody craning their neck to see what's happening. 5 minutes, it's over. The perpetrators have been pulled out and chucked back into the away end, or they've been kicked out into the street by the police. There's a heavy police presence in football grounds in those days, and it was pretty rough. It was very, very basic, but not once did I think we would get caught up in anything. So I was never worried about it. A couple of times I would probably not confess which part of the ground I'd been in if you saw the pictures on a Sunday afternoon on the regional TV, I didn't point out to my mum which part of the ground I was in. I might say I was in that end, but not point exactly where I was because we were right in the middle most weeks. But it was never concern about what was happening on the way into the ground, on the way out, or in the ground. We had a 10-minute walk back to the bus and then sort of half an hour, 40 minutes on the bus home from there. It just didn't think about it as being worried. There were some pretty nasty incidents in that period involving Newcastle, but involving every club. I didn't go to away games. Obviously, I was very young, didn't go to away games in those days. There's a lot of tales. You see people sharing those tales now about where people were caught out, and it would have been exactly the same for away fans who came up to Newcastle. It's an outpost for people from London, perhaps. It's a long way on the train. It is an outpost. It's very isolated from most other clubs in the top flight of English football at that stage. But it was the excitement. The excitement of the football was everything. And that's what I went for. That's what I would talk about for the whole week. I wouldn't be interested in what was going on elsewhere.
Yeah, and in your book, you do mention that St. James's Park was underdeveloped in those days. Was
Yeah.
it self-evident to you even as a young fan?
Yes, it was. I think it's resonated more now when I think back or I see photographs now that the most northeastern outpost of English football was the ground that didn't have a roof on either end. Over the terrace steps, the Gallagher end never had a roof. The Leazes end, which was originally the home end until it got demolished when the team got relegated, had a roof. The roof got taken off. The terrace was truncated to a dozen steps or so. It looked ridiculous, but it stayed that way for the best part of 20 years, which is just the way that the club probably viewed the redevelopment in those days. So it looked odd. It looks like a ground that should have been in the south of France or in northern Italy, where you would have Mediterranean weather. But it was in this bleak outpost up next to the Roman wall in the northeast of England. It was basic. It was only slightly more basic than just about anywhere else in England at the time. But demolishing a home stand seems like something a Manchester United or a Liverpool wouldn't have done without having a plan in place. Basically, the Newcastle home end just got shunted to the other end of the ground to an even more basic open air terrace, and it stayed that way for a long time. One old stand built in about 1910 and a newer stand built in the 70s. A ground that had very few seats, no hospitality, no experience, match day experiences. It was all about you stood on a brick step, concrete step, you leant on a concrete post or a metal post and you watched the game.
In addition to Malcolm McDonald's loss, to a lesser extent, the departures of Frank Clark and backroom coach Keith Birkinshaw, who would go on and achieve success elsewhere, was also a telling sign of the team's decline. In retrospect, do you think most fans and historians mainly blame Gordon Lee?
If I was to give a very short answer, I'd say a lot of people blame Gordon Lee for everything. That all stems from Malcolm MacDonald. I'm sure we'll come on to it, but the team actually did pretty well once MacDonald left for a year at least. Gordon Lee said he didn't like the star system in football. He's probably slightly misquoted on that because I think the message trying to convey was he didn't want a star footballer taking over from everybody else in the team who did a big job. But when he said he didn't want stars in his team and suddenly Malcolm MacDonald is out the door, you think, well, we're going to get journeyman and it's going to be a completely different atmosphere. Keith Birkinshaw, I think at one stage was probably looked at as the heir apparent as a manager. That didn't happen. He went to Tottenham and did pretty well there. Frank Clark was coming to the end of his career, everybody thought, was given a free transfer pretty unceremoniously and joined Nottingham Forest in the second division and then won a league title with Nottingham Forest and went on to greater things right at the end of his career. But you see, those kind of things look like end of an era. Malcolm MacDonald may have been the end of the star era where you were getting footballers of a different mentality to Malcolm MacDonald, and Frank Clark had been there right from the early 60s. He was second on the appearance list at that stage. And I don't think it was the end of his Newcastle career that hit home. It was the fact that it wasn't really handled very well. I think he was told in a dressing room and said, I've just been told I'm leaving at the end of the season. And Malcolm MacDonald pinpointed that as a big change in how the attitude was behind the scenes and used that as a bit of a lever, I think, in his own negotiations.
Incidentally, this Newcastle side, despite the departure of Gordon Lee during the season, would actually, like you said, finish fifth and qualify for Europe. But trouble clearly lay ahead as many of the players wanted to leave. Could you, as a fan at the time, see that coming?
Think at the time there was an astonishment that Newcastle had done so well. I think the begrudging respect that people grew to have for that Gordon Lee team, it was pretty efficient. Alan Gowling and Mickey Burns were scoring goals where Malcolm MacDonald was a bigger star, had been scoring those ones. I think the looking at Gordon Lee and people not wanting to like him, he didn't really have a great record before he came to St James's. Then the quote about not having star players. But I think we also had a lot of there were disputes between the players and the management in there. That bubbled around in the background a lot. There was a lot of distrust and disrespect for the board of directors at that period as well. So the politics in the background wasn't great. There wasn't a unity in there. I think the success of that season getting into Europe probably papered over a lot of cracks. By the end of that season, Gordon Lee had gone. He'd gone to Everton and was replaced by Richard Dinnis, who'd not had a pro career as a player. He'd been a school teacher and then come on board as a coach. Player power was involved in that. Then he only lasted 9 months. So I think the run into Europe papered over quite a lot of those cracks. And then once there isn't that success, they come to the surface and they're pretty difficult to paper over at that point.
At the end of the 1977-78 season, Newcastle United finished 21st and were relegated. In the 70s, the likes of Manchester United and Tottenham had been relegated but had bounced back up immediately. So, was there the same feeling regarding Newcastle United initially, perhaps?
I think blind faith is probably the expression at that stage. Whatever life throws at us, it's all right. When Newcastle United will be back up, then there is a sense of there is a dawn breaks and look at it a bit more closely. Another manager has gone. The season, I think probably the biggest hit was the fact that Newcastle hadn't just been relegated, they'd been humiliated in that year. They used something like 35 players, a lot of young players came in, absolute lambs to the slaughter. I would have absolutely done anything to play for Newcastle United when I was old enough, but when I look back and think, did it do any of those guys any good that got thrown in, had two or three games, went back into the reserves, never seen again, or went into the fourth division? It didn't do a lot of them an awful lot of good. So I think there was that false sense of security. Also in the first season, do okay, start fairly well after relegation. Do we, is that blind faith now going to be repaid straight away? How quickly does that become, we're never going to get out of this hole? And that sort of evolved over those first 4 years of the wilderness, certainly. But it was, I don't think we were as bullish as Manchester United, even looking back on the disaster of Manchester United being relegated. They were only ever going to be in the second division for a year. Tottenham, yeah, they slipped and got back in. Chelsea, Manchester City. There's quite a lot of teams went into the second division who you'd think have a better track record than that. And you just, as a youngster, you just think, oh, it's all right, we're going to win every week. Well, patently, I'd been through a season where we got nowhere near winning every week. And until it's mathematically impossible, as a young fan, you're always sitting there thinking, oh, we'll win this week, we'll win this week. There's no gallows humour, there's no black humour on the terraces when you're 10, 11, 12-year old. You're there taking everything in black and white, forgive the pun, as wins and losses without sort of seeing the nuances of it. But we did think, yeah, it's all right. We'll be back. We'll be back. They've done it before. Newcastle have been in the second division before my time. My dad had seen them in the second division. We'll be back. We'll be fine.
And during the relegation season, Richard Dennis was sacked, and in November, Bill McCary was appointed as manager, and he would manage the team in the then second division. So, can you describe the backbone of the Newcastle United squad as they start their life in the second division in 1978?
Yeah, I didn't really think of this. Probably even when I was starting to put the story together, I had a lot of memories of a lot of signings who you don't think are up to it, not going to get you promoted. How many players in a second division team are going to stay with you if they get you into the first division is a pretty good way of gauging a promotion kind of team. But at the time, you just think, we'll get there hook or by crook somehow. And then afterwards, looking at it and think that first season, Bill McGarry assembled a fairly decent second division team. There were some journeymen in there. I made some notes thinking about this again. And Alan Gowling had outscored Malcolm MacDonald in a season together, but he was gone as soon as there was the team relegated. Alan Kennedy went to win a European Cup or two with Liverpool. You're losing a bit of quality. There were some players in there who had been there and done it and seen it, who got injured, which doesn't help. The young lads didn't really have an anchor to fasten themselves to. There was a lot of changes, but some of those players were certainly good enough to be at the top end of the second division and perhaps into the first division. And then Peter Withe was the one where we couldn't believe our luck, bringing a guy in who'd won a league title with Nottingham Forest to then be reunited with Bill McGarry, who he'd worked with before. But then that changes fairly quickly, and there are a lot of second division signings rather than potential first division signings who come in around that time.
Yeah, and I was surprised. I didn't remember this. Mark McGee, who later played for Aberdeen, he played for Newcastle, but obviously he was transferred at the end of that relegation season. You have others like Terry Hibbett coming from Birmingham, Scottish signings like John Connolly from Birmingham as well, John Brownlee from Hibs. But of course, Peter Witt was the main marquee signing, I would
Yeah.
say.
And I think if you look at them, looking at that squad, Bill McGarry invested in experience. The previous season, the first half was the end of one team and then a load of kids thrown in randomly in the second part of it. Bill McGarry went for the likes of Colin Suggett, Jim Pearson, John Connolly. They'd had a bit of a track record elsewhere. Colin Suggett had more than a bit of a record. He was a bit of a wonderkind when he came through in the game. Pearson and Connolly had done pretty well in the first division as it was. John Brownlee had been a Manchester United target when he was in Scotland with Hibernian. He'd been a Newcastle target. He'd broken a leg, come back. There was a definite sign of quality. John Blackley was part of Scotland's 1974 World Cup squad, even if he wasn't particularly well known in England. That was a very good Scotland squad that went to West Germany for the 74 World Cup. So there is quality in there. It just didn't stick together long enough. There was a lot of changes round and about week to week virtually, and then some key parts of that disappeared. Terry Hibbett came back to the club after he was Malcolm MacDonald's other foot really in the early 70s, the creator in chief. He went away to Birmingham and came back as club captain, a very fiery individual with a big winner's attitude, I suppose you'd call it, having been brought up with that Leeds team. But he was coming towards the end of his career there. Lost a lot of players through knee injuries. Jim Pearson, Colin Suggett was an injured player as well. Terry Hibbett was eventually lost through knee injuries. Irving Nattrass was a very classy player, had a lot of injuries. David Craig was retired with an injury. All that doesn't help when you're trying to get a new squad together. You're probably going to have to use a lot of kids once you get relegated. And if they haven't got those senior heads around them, it can be pretty difficult.
Yeah, and other familiar names would be Tommy Cassidy, the Northern Irish midfielder. Also, the Irish midfielder Mick Martin joined a
Yeah.
few months into the season. But Newcastle would finish eighth in this first season in the second division. The new arrival, Peter Witt, he was there essentially as a replacement for Malcolm McDonald. Similar features, tall, muscular, good in the air. What was his impact despite the team stagnating?
Yeah, I think we'd signed that one and Imre Varadi, who comes later in the 6 seasons of the Wilderness. Almost they're the shaft of light in all of the darkness that's around them. Peter with a proper focal point for a centre forward. It was the age there where I'm starting to play football in secondary school and didn't realise how much work a centre forward did facing his own goal. And you realised with Peter with proper target man, he really worked hard for the team. He dished out a bit of treatment. He took a lot of treatment from big defenders because a lot of the time he's there to hold the ball up. But he came in there. He'd had quite a slow start to his career. He travelled around a lot in his early part of his career, and then towards the end of his career, he wins a league title with Forest. Does very well at Newcastle over 2 seasons, then goes to Aston Villa and scores the goal that wins a European Cup, which he swears didn't go in off his right shin, but you can watch it quite a few times. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. A deadly finish from a couple of yards in a European Cup final, we'd all take that. But he was a definite touch of quality there. And I think what the manager looking now, you look at there and you think you have a couple of hints of quality in your team, and what you want to do is see the players around them sort of rub off that quality onto them, and they up their game to bring them into line with somebody like Peter With. And Newcastle did it with a player they signed from non-league football who worked in the coal mines, a lad called Alan Shoulder. Became a proper old-fashioned English little and large centre-forward combination, the two of them, and had a great time. But Alan Shoulder came into Newcastle in his mid-20s, having never played professional football, and became one of the best players in the squad, which probably tells you a lot for the state of non-league football at the time, but also of the state of second division football that he made such an impact.
And of course, the fans would have to adjust to a new reality in the second division. I know you said you didn't travel to away venues, but I mean, a lot of fans had to go to relatively unknown locations. There was naturally a lack of television coverage. There already wasn't that much, as you pointed out, and there was even less as the team was in the second division. And I imagine the only media attention would be from the local avenues, so to speak, radio, local television, etc. So it's a whole new reality. How did you yourself adjust to these changes?
Yeah, there's a big difference between looking at final score on the TV on 4:45 on a Saturday night, and you see the names Manchester United and Liverpool and Arsenal and Everton, and then you realise that Newcastle United's not mentioned on that page, and then you turn the page after they've done the classified check of those results. Of course, everything kicked off at 3 o'clock on a Saturday then, so it was the full 11 games. Then it goes on to the second page. You're looking for the name of Newcastle United, and it's in the company of, without being disrespectful, some very small clubs who were overachieving, perhaps the Cambridge, Shrewsbury, Orient, Notts County, Bristol Rovers, who were perhaps getting 6,000 in their home games. The guys who travelled, and it was 99% guys in those days, the guys who travelled actually liked the adventure of going to those kind of places, especially as Newcastle would probably make up a third or a half of the crowd in a lot of those small ones. There's also big clubs in the second division, rivalries with the likes of Chelsea or West Ham, and our nearest and dearest local derby rivals with Sunderland and Middlesbrough from time to time. So there were some big clubs in there with some big crowds as well. But yes, you're away from the glare of even the national newspapers in a big respect. We're fortunate in the UK, or were then, that the local media was so strong. An evening paper in most towns. There's local radio, commercial radio, or BBC radio in most regions. So there'd still be the travelling media pack from each patch. And I've worked in those kind of patches myself, so I know how strongly they get behind their clubs for good or for bad, wherever their fortunes may be. There's big stories coming out of your local clubs. But yeah, I think there's a novelty in there. People also love afterwards. We've all got stories of hardship going to the worst places, the furthest away places. The 7:45 FA Cup replay at Exeter, which is probably 450, 500 miles away. People love to have the wear it like a badge, like a medal of honor, to say, yeah, I was there, got home at 4 o'clock in the morning, went to work at 6 o'clock. We've all got those kind of stories. But also the novelty wears off when you've had 2 or 3 seasons of that. You want to get back amongst the Liverpools and Manchester Uniteds of this world, and the Newcastle squads of those eras aren't going to win every week, but they're going to have some good wins against those teams from time to time. There is a change in reality. It was that thing on the Saturday night that always got me looking at the league table and having to wait for the next page. Sometimes it went from Division 1 to Scottish Division 1 and then into Division 2, and hurry up, where are we? That is the slap in the face, really, when the first or second week comes round of the season and you start getting used to, lower down the page, wherever you which by whichever parameter you want to measure it, you lower down the page, and that's the stark reality.
The 1979-80 season was more of the same as the team finished ninth. And at the end of the season, Peter Witt left to join Aston Villa. Did the fans at this point believe the second division spell would last longer than anticipated?
To quote a famous UK sitcom, I would say this time next year we could be millionaires. There's always that feeling, isn't there, amongst football fans? This is our year. And after the first 3 weeks of the season, when you've got 1 point on the board, perhaps it's not this year. We'll wait until August next year, and this is the year. But I think, having seen Newcastle that first season, I think they finished 14 points short of promotion, but only about 8 points above relegation when it was 2 points for a win. So the eighth place, if you say eighth, you think we weren't far off the top three. We were actually much closer to the bottom three at that stage. But there were some decent results in there, and you think, oh, we can build on that. This is going to be our year. This is how we're going to get out. Surely we can't be in this division for yet another season. But it only takes a couple of results, and then that changes to you almost write off the season and can't wait for August again. When you lose Peter With, your first reaction will be, what we're going to replace him with. I think Newcastle have shown that in this era, they weren't always the best at replacing what they've got. So there was a nervousness then and a certain resignation, I think, in the club that one of the things I've realised when I started revisiting was the club very quickly became a second division club. Not necessarily all of the players, but there was just this pervading attitude that we were in a different league now in the terms of who we bought, how much we were going to spend, crowds were down. It took more than a couple of good results in a row to get the crowds back up again. You get that sinking feeling that at some stage we'll get promoted, but it doesn't look like it's imminent, and that's not a great way to approach a Saturday afternoon.
For the 1980-81 season, there would be a new manager appointed, Arthur Cox, as Bill McCary would be sacked in the autumn. But the team would do even worse as it finished 11th. And I imagine the only satisfaction historically was the arrival of a then young unknown Chris Waddle. So, what was the takeaway at this point about the team's future?
Oh, I think that is the season where if you were to reel off the names of players you didn't think you'd see in a Newcastle shirt, most of them played in that season. And I don't want to single them out because it's a team game, a team responsibility. But there were a lot of players in that 80-81 season who would not have played for Newcastle under other circumstances. And then in the middle of it all, we hear about a young striker in the reserves who was doing pretty well. I remember his debut against Shrewsbury in a midweek game. I think it was a 0-0, but I remember it was Shrewsbury. Peter With's younger brother, Chris, made his debut in the same game. Chris, unfortunately, only made a couple of appearances for Newcastle as a left back, but Chris Waddle came in. The story of him having worked in a factory that made sausage seasoning obviously is that's a gift to local newspapers. They love that kind of story. He played non-league football. He hadn't been scouted that much previously, and he came in. He was probably being played as a centre forward, but quite quickly I realised this isn't a new Peter With. This isn't a guy who gets the ball on the halfway, spins, races to the far post, waits for a high ball to come in and pushes the centre half out of the way to get a header in on goal. Chris Waddle had, although he was tall, very languid style, all left foot. And really what you saw with Tottenham and Marseille and England later is just a polished version of what he was straight away. Get the ball in the middle of the pitch and then go across to one wing or the other. A lot of good skill, individual skill. But coming into that team, it must have been really difficult to be a young lad, even if you're going well, to come into that team. And I think there was a point of Chris had to be convinced, he had to convince himself that he was a good player. He probably felt really good at the level he'd been playing at before, but he probably need convincing over the next couple of seasons that he was good enough at this level. He came into the team, went out of the team, and when he came back in, had to convince people he was good enough. But I think probably the top of his list was convincing himself. And Arthur Cox had a look, trying to fill a few holes, wasn't quite there yet. The club spent some money. Nick Harford came in at £200,000. John Truick came in as a record signing at 250,000. So it's not like the club wouldn't get their hands in their pockets. But Arthur Cox had come in from a third division club at Chesterfield. We didn't know an awful lot about him. Did that say a lot about the club that they were now looking in the third division for the managers? There's quite a lot of big name managers with Northeast heritage and Northeast roots who would get mentioned, but how many of them would actually leave the job they're in to come to the Northeast in a club that was probably a pretty intimidating job at that stage, not quite sure the relationship between the manager and the board, the ambitions of the board. But give them their due, they provided some money to be spent from that Peter With money as well. At the end of the season, some of the money was spent. It just had to go a long way. There was a lot of gaps in quality in that squad.
For the 1981-82 season, we have the arrival of Imre Varadi from Everton, but the team once again finished at mid-table ninth, and they were seemingly unable to make any headway. As a fan, how did you see the situation as you had endured 4 years in the second division by this time?
Yeah, I think at this point, this is the point where I'll be, what, 15? I was very aware of how many conversations among people of my dad's generation, our next door neighbours, and people my dad worked with. There's an awful lot of conversations that were talking about Newcastle teams of the 60s and 70s by this stage. They weren't talking about this team and their ambitions for this team and favourite players in this team. It seemed like nostalgia had become very popular, talking about players who'd retired 10 years earlier because they had a better record and a better history than the current one. And then you go into 4 years and you're thinking there's no quick way out of this now. They look around the ground and the region. It's a pretty depressed region by this stage with social problems as well. And I think that this is going to be what is going to be the magic that turns this team into a promotion chasing team. And I think the hope that kills you at Newcastle at this stage is they were always not on the fringes of promotion. They were in the group just behind that. So you think all it takes is two or three results, three or four results, and we're back in it. And the failure to string those results together while other people were 11th again, ninth. There's not no without playoffs, which didn't come in until a lot later. Without the playoffs, you're aiming for the top three, and you're sitting in ninth, 10th, 11th. Your season is over a long time before the end of May. So it's pretty uninspiring and demotivating at that point, wondering where this little spark is going to come. Imre Varadi was, like I said with Peter With, was a silver lining in there. He was probably as quick as Malcolm MacDonald, but not a powerful player. He's quite a slim built guy. Came in with not much of a professional football past. He'd been at Sheffield United, been at Everton, but he's very young. And a bit like Chris Waddle, you think, I look at it now and think a 23-year-old being given the Newcastle number 9 shirt when you haven't got a great record as a 21, 22-year-old and you're coming into a team that's got no great record for the last 4 years, there's a lot of pressure there. And if you can come through it, you're going to be a big player, but it can be very difficult and you can get buried. If it doesn't work out for you, you can get buried by all of that.
Well, in the summer of 1982, and the event that changed everything, the arrival of Kevin Keegan. Can you describe how and when you heard the news and your immediate reaction?
Yeah, even thinking about it now, I have to smile. And as I start talking about it, I'll probably get quicker and quicker and more excited because it is an absolutely iconic moment in Newcastle United's history. I liked Kevin Keegan as a player before that. He liked proving people wrong. He's a little guy with quite a fiery attitude to life, and he was a winner. I was going to say born winner. He wasn't. He struggled to make the grade before Scunthorpe and then Liverpool took him, but he turned himself, and the managers who worked with him turned him into an absolute top class player with Liverpool and Hamburg and Southampton and England. For Newcastle to be connected with him, I do remember being on holiday and seeing it in a national newspaper and thinking it was newspaper talk because there's no way Kevin Keegan will come to Newcastle. This is mental. This is just isn't going to happen. I think Leeds were the team that were mentioned then, although he had quite a few options elsewhere in Europe. And being around 15, 16-year-old by this time, you're probably thinking, you know it all, and he'll do this, he'll do that, come up with all the answers. Knowing that Kevin Keegan liked to do things differently, going to Hamburg when he could have gone to Real Madrid, I think at that stage, going to Southampton when he could have really gone anywhere. What a rabbit is going to be pulled out of the hat by Kevin Keegan now. He was still England captain, don't forget. He'd had a really disappointing World Cup in 82, which was the first World Cup since 1970 England had been in, and possibly the disappointment of that pushed him into doing something pretty huge and giving the football world a bit of a rattle. He has a certain Northeast heritage. He has grandparents from the region, and I think we underestimated at the time how much that meant to him. Certainly meant more and more as time went on. But it was just that bit of, I can't believe this is going to happen. And even when he signed, I thought, I'm not going to believe this till I see him in a black and white shirt. And on that day when he made his debut against QPR in August 82, we would normally go to the ground between 1 o'clock and 1:30. We were there at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, queuing up with a sitting against the wall. Obviously, by the time the pubs chucked out at 1, 1:30, we were miles away from the turnstile because they all just piled in, a lot bigger than us. They piled in near the front. And I say in the book, I remember being dehydrated and hot and sweaty that day in the crowd and having to fight my way into one of the little bunkers to go and get a soft drink. But actually, when you watch footage of it, Kevin Keegan runs out and he looks frozen to death. He's got a sweatshirt on top of his kit. He's rubbing his hands together. He looks frozen. My only recollection is being really hot on that day. So it just shows the different perceptions you have of things. But it's a monumental moment, and everything that's happened since comes down to that moment in 1982. Top marks to Arthur Cox, a manager who Kevin Keegan, let's be honest, probably knew very little about, coming from the third division at Chesterfield. But the powers that be at Newcastle, give them credit for once for manufacturing the circumstances that could bring Kevin Keegan in, the breweries who paid their part in part of the finance of that as well. And then it just took off. I went to his debut then a couple of nights later. He opened a sports shop in Newcastle, and I made sure I was there because they just think, I've just got to see Kevin Keegan. And it's astonishing that the signing of Alan Shearer for a world record £15 million, 15 years later, is absolutely nothing to the size of the shock of having Kevin Keegan, the current England captain and a twice European Footballer of the Year, to come to your club, who had just finished in mid-table in the second division. And I do wonder what those homegrown players who'd watched him on TV and had posters on the wall suddenly saw him sat next to them in the dressing room. And we know that he was quite shocked by the standards of some of the players around him as well, thinking it might not be quite as quite as easygoing as I thought. But what a challenge! What a man for taking it on. Yes, he was very handsomely rewarded for it, but he could have had a lap of honour at the end of his career, and he did absolutely the opposite. He took on a huge challenge and just led everybody with his power of his will, I think, as much as the power of his talent.
And it was a perfect shot in the arm that Newcastle needed. And his factor brought with it other players like Mick Shannon, also joined from Southampton. Irish defender John Anderson also arrived that season. And later, a few months after that, you have Terry McDermott returning to Newcastle. Also, Northern Irish midfielder David McCreary also joined. So I imagine a lot of it has to do with the Kevin Keegan factor. And there would be clear and noticeable improvement on the field as the team finished fifth in the 1982-83 season. Were there also changes off the field that led to the improvement and the match going experience?
Yeah, it may be a period where everybody in the club is pointing in the same direction, and I think it's fair to say there hasn't been a huge number of those around that time. But the positivity, you get 36,000 in for Keegan's debut. Yes, it dropped off to 20 odd thousand for the next home game, but then the excitement starts to build, and a couple of results does make a difference then. Probably Keegan comes in, all the supporters were thinking, well, we're promoted. Just because Kevin Keegan's in the team, you think you're promoted. And obviously, it doesn't work like that. Every other club wants to make sure it's the one that brings Kevin Keegan down. But when I talked about the club signing definite second division players in the 4 years before that, if you bring Kevin Keegan in, Terry McDermott comes in, won European Cups and League Championships with Liverpool. His quality was unbelievable in that season, and he had difficulties with the quality of some of the players around him. There's stories in his own book about going to see the manager, not happy about he was making the kind of runs and the kind of passes he made for Liverpool. Well, he didn't have the kind of players around him that had been with at Liverpool. So it was a bit of an education for him. John Anderson, you mentioned there, he was given a free by Preston. who weren't ever going to be promoted up to the first division in those days. He was given a free there and suddenly finds himself in the dressing room with Kevin Keegan. A couple of players who perhaps had hit the skids at their clubs suddenly come in and they're sharing a dressing room with Kevin Keegan. It just shows the way that things can turn and how much positivity really matters and momentum really matters in sport. If you can get the right people in and start a bandwagon rolling, I think as fans, we were thinking it was certain promotion. So there's quite a slow start to that season. Probably helps because that tempers your expectation for the rest of the season. Perhaps we start thinking it's all right, we're bedding in this year. But Kevin Keegan hadn't at that point decided whether he was staying for another season. So that has its own difficulties. Is this our one shot at getting promotion with Kevin Keegan, or are we going to have another go? That breeds its own sort of uncertainty. But definitely the change in positivity all around and in the crowd, expecting things to happen. The sound went up whenever Kevin did anything. Imre Varadi was in really good form, learning as well. I would imagine he's a young player learning alongside Kevin Keegan. The two of them were involved in that winning goal at Keegan's goal on his debut. It must have done him a world of good. And Kevin Keegan was actually outscored by Imre Varadi by one goal that season. Can you imagine being the 23, 24-year-old Imre Varadi and thinking, I've had such a good season, I've scored more than the Messiah who was coming in to get us promoted, fresh from a World Cup. That's an amazing shot in the arm for the squad as a whole and for individual players as well.
Well, with Keegan staying, I imagine the 1983-84 season was seen as a foregone conclusion that you would be promoted. And you have the arrival of a certain Peter Beardsley that season, who, of course, we all know the legend that he would become. This season is the historic season where, after 6 years, Newcastle goes up, achieves promotion, and you have the strike force of Waddle, Keegan, and Beardsley. Just imagine that in the second division. And after 6 years, Newcastle was up. Can you paint a picture of that season?
Yeah, I think by that stage there is a now or never mentality. Kevin Keegan was not going to take missing out on his promise really that the club were going to get promoted. He hadn't written that many fairy tales in his career by that stage. I think the fairy tales were coming later because he'd been involved in successful teams. They weren't fairy tales. At that point, his strength of will to bring those players along with him. You've got McCreary and McDermott in midfield. There's a quality there. Chris Waddle was growing into being a Newcastle United homegrown hero. Peter Beardsley came in. We'd heard of Peter Beardsley. He played for Wallsend Boys Club, who had all of the best young players in the region season in, season out. He hadn't been taken on by the club, but the club's old captain Bob Moncur had taken him to Carlisle. Then he'd gone to Vancouver. He'd had a short spell at Manchester United. We didn't really know how he played. We just knew that this was a little gem of a player in the standard he was at. And then the next breath, he was in the team, and within 2, 3 games, absolutely astonished. He played like the best players that we knocked around with, played in a similar kind of style where he could dominate everything, but we were schoolboys playing on a piece of waste ground or on a school pitch. He was doing this in the second division, and I think Kevin Keegan, having seen some of the lack of quality around him at times in that first season, must have looked at Peter Beardsley very, very quickly in that season and thought, we've got an absolute diamond here. He was the heir apparent to Keegan, a similar kind of build and strength, more individual at times, more individual skill than Kevin Keegan, perhaps. But he just grew from his first appearance in a black and white shirt, and it was, this is it. This is the Holy Trinity, the Keegan, Beardsley, Waddle era. Scored some spectacular goals that season. Portsmouth away is the one when he walks it into the goal everybody talks about. And then the last game, the Brighton game, when Newcastle score three and they score one each, and they all have a hand in each other's goals. That's the kind of fairy tale that we came to associate with Kevin Keegan after that. And wanting Peter Beardsley to take his number 7 shirt afterwards, that is just, it's an astonishing way to finish your career. If you had to write your own career story after achieving what he had achieved. Kevin thought he was leaving the club in very capable hands. We see that not necessarily so in every season, but it was such an exciting season. Newcastle blew a few teams away that season. Manchester City 5-0 at St James's. And when they got motoring, when they got a momentum, it was a pity that Imre Varadi had to be sacrificed to put that three together. But when those three bedded in, they either took turns in being the most influential player on the pitch, or they sparked each other off. If you're a second division defender in that era, there was one strike force that you didn't want to play against. The fact that Newcastle didn't win the league was probably a little in the back of the head a disappointment when you've got those three. But I think in the end, finishing third, who cares? It was promotion. That's what it was all about. And had some real quality tussles with the teams in the top 4 and 5 positions that season as well. But yeah, a very magical season. And I was at exactly the right age to take a lot out of there. So 17 in that year, feeling a bit more grown up and a bit more football coverage on TV and a bit more chat about our club. And you can see, yeah, if we keep going how we're going, this is going to be a promotion season. But being Newcastle, you couldn't take it for granted until the maths had been done and promotion was won right at the end of the season. And very emotional last couple of weeks in that season, even for a 17-year-old who doesn't want to be emotional about these things. You get taken over by it.
With promotion achieved, Kevin Keegan retired. Was there a belief that despite his retirement, at least the team appeared to be on a sound footing now that they were up?
I thought about this quite a bit when I was putting the book together to find the conclusion really in there. And at the time, I think we were just so blindly following that promotion bandwagon that once you got to the end of May, we didn't really care what was happening the next season. It was let's celebrate Newcastle being promoted. Keegan had announced in the season that it would be his last, so everything was on that season, not on the next one. He'd probably piled even more pressure on himself and his teammates by saying it would be his last season because we knew there would not be another Kevin Keegan coming in the following season if he left with that feat unaccomplished. So there was just that focus, promotion, promotion, promotion. Then as you get there, you think, we've got Waddle and Beardsley. We've got two-thirds of this magical strike force. They probably need somebody to do some donkey work for them up front as well, but we've got to have the players to bring out the best in Peter Beardsley and Chris Waddle, who are both young men. Newcastle loves local heroes. Most clubs love their locals, wanting them to succeed. And then as the summer moved on, we think we'll be all right. We'll be all right. We're not going to win the title. It wasn't like John Hall's era where Newcastle said, move aside, we're coming through, and got promotion with Kevin Keegan and John Hall. But there was this point in the summer as well where there's changes in the back room, and Arthur Cox, who's taken the team to promotion, doesn't last much longer after falling out with the board. And there's a change there, and the team starts to take on a different look and structure with Jack Charlton. Although half of that promotion team stayed through the next 4 or 5 seasons with Newcastle, there was a pretty good spine to that stayed. But the reality comes once you start that first division season, once you get a few results under your belt, you think you enjoy the first time you meet Manchester United, the first time you play Liverpool, and at some point it also kicks in. You think, yeah, it's great to enjoy it, but we've got to get points on the board as well. Otherwise, we'll be back to square one. But just that, the overriding emotion was just get there, and we'll worry about that afterwards.
Yeah, and it's fair to say that without Kevin Keegan, most likely the team would have stagnated further in the second division. And part of the story is this romantic narrative of a man saving a club that was seemingly headed nowhere and giving belief to his younger teammates. Now, with all modesty, can a comparison be made to the impact that Maradona had at Napoli?
I've seen that movie, the Maradona movie, where the car goes through the streets that takes him, I think it's from the airport to the stadium, doesn't it? And it is absolutely incredible the way that that city goes so mad for Maradona. The stereotypical inner city Italian driving. I think it's up on the curb at points, and there's people trying to get cars out of the way. There's police outriders. It doesn't really matter because the driver of that car is getting Maradona to the stadium as quick as he possibly can. It's a good comparison. I think it's Newcastle region is hugely passionate about its football club, possibly not as intense passion as you see in that Maradona movie. There are definite similarities to the narrative there, though, of someone taking on a challenge they didn't have to. Maradona, Barcelona, Keegan, Real Madrid, they could have taken on different routes and been very happy playing in other quality teams. Maradona goes there, and I can't remember how long it was since they'd won a title, but it was an incredible amount
They've
of
never
time.
won a title.
And that inspires them. I would say Kevin Keegan's only failing, and very harsh in saying this, is we never won a title either. But just the way that it can transform a club, a city, a region, a set of fans to give them something to believe in. You drew the comparison, not me. I have my own views on there, but to have that as a fan and to see the passion for a team and for a player when you're right in the middle of it is absolutely unbeatable. And there's even when Kevin came back as manager, it did not match the just that passion, the intensity of his first game, that QPR game, and then at the end of that second season getting promotion. But it's yes, there's not many of those fairy tales in football where somebody can almost single-handedly pull things around like that. They are two very, very good stories around a similar narrative.
How had the football culture landscape change in these 6 years? Is football the same everywhere, or is following a team in the lower divisions a radically different experience?
Oh, it's radically different, I would say, first of all. The disparity between the biggest clubs in the second division and the smaller clubs in the second division is enormous. There will be in the first division at that time, I wouldn't have thought there's a huge amount of difference between the sixth and seventh place clubs and those at the bottom. But in the second division, you've got the teams who think they should be in the first. You've got the teams who are possibly season in, season out, going to be in mid-table in that kind of bracket and are going to be very fortunate to get out of it. And then you've got some clubs who perhaps getting into the second division is the absolute peak of their existence. I remember a couple of seasons before Newcastle, Hereford got into that division on the small ground they had. They'd been a non-league club 10 years earlier. So it is radically different. I think Newcastle probably enjoyed it that we're a big fish in a small pond, especially for away games, taking an awful lot of supporters to away games. But culturally, and the way that English football at that time, Newcastle decided it would be those 6 years is the 6 years when English football dominates Europe. Was it six European Cups in a row with Liverpool and Forest and Aston Villa in that sequence at the exact same time that Newcastle slipped to arguably the lowest point in their history, certainly over a sustained period of those first 4 years in the wilderness. So there's a massive change there. Just when the spotlight is coming onto English football is the point where Newcastle drop out of it. And as a fan, I would say that's not right. If there's a good period for English football, then Newcastle should be right in the middle of that. So there was a big change between first and second division. And these days, the championship as it is has a TV deal, has coverage on its own websites and its own social medias and magazines and other platforms. At that point, everything was around the top flight. Not the wall to wall that the Premier League has now, but still, it was all based on the top. Otherwise, you were just a regional team in a regional newspaper, a regional TV program. So there is a massive difference between the first and second division at that point, which there is financially now, but profile wise, Championship has definitely picked up more of a profile than the second division ever had.
You got to witness the worst of the second division, and a few years later, you witnessed the great team of the 90s. So, how surreal was this difference?
Yeah, having Newcastle listed as in the media as everyone's second favourite team during that second Keegan era, the entertainers era, that's pretty surreal. this outpost in the top corner of the country is suddenly liked by others. I think people that I've lived and worked around the country since I left school, so I've been in the company of people who support lots of other teams, and they always would talk about crazy Newcastle support, how incredible the level of support was for the team. There were long periods in that spell where they didn't talk about the players on the pitch, but they knew that Newcastle crowd was pretty special. And then you come to a point where those same people were asking me, should we go to the pub to watch the Newcastle game against Chelsea that's on the on the telly on Monday night, or that kind of thing. Those two famous 4-3 games against Liverpool where you probably couldn't get into a pub because everybody in town was going to watch those games at the dawn of the Sky Sports era and the mega coverage that that was bringing with it. And people who had no association with the region who suddenly read as much as you did about your team. That was very strange, but it was good to have people on your side, and there were a lot of people who wanted Newcastle to take Manchester United off top spot. And a lot of people were watching those Liverpool games, the 4-3s, hoping Newcastle would win 4-3 rather than lose 4-3. And we hadn't experienced that, but I hadn't experienced that before, and probably not experienced it a lot since. We were there to shake up the norm, shake up what people had become used to, and to do that in the manner that Newcastle did with the entertainment and the excitement that they did at that point, and to keep spending money at that point was just astonishing. We hadn't been used to building from a position of strength, which is what Liverpool had done in the 70s and 80s and what Manchester United did in the 90s. Newcastle had tended to buy a big player and then wait until that big player's gone and buy another big player. But suddenly, I think Keegan uses the expression, we created a monster that we had to keep feeding. So they kept breaking the club record signings, broke it for a central defender with Darren Peacock. A club like Newcastle spending record amounts of money on a central defender for somebody like me who'd watched Newcastle not able to keep a clean sheet for season after season. That was fairly astonishing. And of course, they broke the record very quickly after that central defender go out and buy another striker, then another striker, and another striker. So it was, yeah, and it was bandwagon momentum again. Once you built some momentum in sport, it counts for a lot.
What were the lessons learned on and off the field regarding Newcastle's years in the second division? Are there any causes that you may have learned through your research?
First thing I'd say from there is we didn't stay in the top flight for that long after the first promotion with Kevin Keegan. So I'm not sure the club as a whole learned that many lessons at all. But I think what evolved from there was you can see what can be done by a club where everybody in it is pointing in the same direction and everybody believes in what they are doing. They have a plan. If you have a leader like Kevin Keegan, I don't think there's any excuse for anybody to be pointing in the wrong direction. When he came back as manager, there was very much a sense of, I'm in charge, follow me. And perhaps previously managers had not been strong enough or perhaps in a strong enough position to be able to do that. Kevin Keegan threatened to resign numerous times when he was a manager because either he felt he'd gone as far as he could or the club weren't backing him in the way that he thought they could or the way that he said they had at the start, which is what happened in his first season in 1992. It wasn't like this in the brochure, I think was the expression he used. But when you get everybody pointing in one direction in a club that has that much support, that size infrastructure and that much goodwill in the region, I think it takes a lot of stopping. And obviously money helps. Newcastle came into a position where Sir John Hall came in, and it was absolutely not that money was no object. John Hall had to find the finance from various places as well as his own investments. But it was knew that if the players arrived in sufficient quantity and quality, the crowds would stay up, the sponsorship would go up, that bandwagon would get faster and faster. So the lessons for me were leadership and unity and ambition. I think there's a huge amount to be said for having an ambition. Kevin Keegan could convince people that Newcastle were going to win things. He has that power of will as a leader, but also the ambition. Why not say it? Why not tell Manchester United, we're coming for you? Move aside, Liverpool, we're coming. That kind of thing. It had never been thought of before, certainly never been said before. And it was almost like even the season that Newcastle got into the UEFA Cup, it was we've done well here, we're fifth. Well, actually, that season Newcastle could have gone top. The game they lost to Arsenal, they could have gone top, and they were around third and fourth quite a bit towards the end of the season before finishing fifth. But Kevin Keegan would have said, yeah, fifth is one thing, but there are four positions bigger than that, and we want to be in the one that's right at the top. So those kind of lessons, and we've probably learned them the hard way once or twice since as well. There has been politics behind the scenes, there has been unpopular owners and unpopular managers at times, but when that ship is all pointing in the right direction and everybody on it is pointing in the right direction, it can be a pretty great force to stop.
So, in closing, what is the legacy of those 6 years in the second division for the culture and the history of the club and the region?
The first response to that would be, I think the biggest impact of those 6 years was the arrival of Kevin Keegan in '82, because what happened in the 90s and since wouldn't have happened without forging that relationship with Kevin Keegan that started in those 2 seasons as a player. He retired. He had no intentions of coming back to football. I don't think there were many people knocking on his door to bring him back into football. He did some commentary, I remember, on German football on a Friday night it was on in the UK in the early days of Borussia Dortmund doing well. I used to watch that. I used to watch that partly because you heard Kevin Keegan's voice again. Other than that, he was playing golf and looking after investments in Spain and his business world. But everything that has happened since then spawned from having a relationship with Kevin Keegan that he probably felt he had some unfinished business once he started again at Newcastle, and was bold enough to think he was the person that was going to bring all of the heartache and the wilderness to an end, also as a manager. So that's a big part of the impact of those 6 years. And I think the other part of it, which I've seen in some of the comments around the review of my book from fans rather than from professional reviewers or websites like that, the big part has been appreciate what you've got. We're in a situation now where a star striker might not be there for very much longer. Yeah, been there, done that. Nobody wants to see your star players leave when they've had an impact, but Newcastle have been through it before. And a couple of seasons ago, you think, yeah, we finished, was it eighth after previously being in the Europa League the season before? And oh, we've slipped from the top four and five clubs to eighth and ninth. Well, got news for you. We slipped to 11th in the second division, and we were our big games when Newcastle got promoted. I think Grimsby were fifth when Newcastle went up in third, and Shrewsbury were just behind them. Now, we know what the wilderness is. Not for a second thinking that the modern world of football has Newcastle in the wilderness, but nobody's entitled to be in those top even 8, 10, 12 positions. Nobody's entitled to it. We saw that with Manchester United and Tottenham last year, that you can have a rocky season, and Newcastle have had a few rocky seasons in the years since. But certainly, my first mode of defence is attack when somebody has a bad moment to say about what a disgusting display it was on Saturday, or how can we let certain player go, or whatever. And there's a little smile goes on behind the teeth, and you think, yeah. We've been there. I've been there with 11,000 in the ground, and we're worried that they haven't sold the last 3,000 seats in a 55,000 seater stadium, or those kind of problems. Everybody wants the team to be good now, and Newcastle probably over the years have specialised in having a glorious history rather than a glorious now. But there are still those bits where you go, we've had some pretty down moments in the past as well. So I'm not going to get too upset. I've seen a few relegations in my time. I've seen a few bad players in my time and a few bad decisions in and out with players and managers. But I'm going to count my blessings that since 1982, when Kevin Keegan came in, at least we haven't revisited those first 4 years of second division football that we had when I was a youngster going to the games for the first time.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview.
Thank you.
All
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, and all our respective contact information and the links to your book are on the blog and podcast uploads. Again, the book is The Wilderness Years, Newcastle United, 1978 to 1984. So, thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.